Hello, I'm Christopher Lee. Welcome to Ghosts. Welcome to Hobbs Manor, my friend. Please excuse me for calling you out at such a late hour. I trust you had a pleasant journey. Mark my words, you have an eventful time ahead of you. Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Dr. Marcus Grimalkin, and I have devoted my life to the study of the paranormal. It is time for me to decide once and for all whether ghosts are reality or fiction. I hope that you can help me to make this decision. My visit to Hobbs Manor, a house that is world famous for its ghostly activities, is the climax of my life's work. I came here to gather the evidence around me, the documents, films, and records that I have painstakingly collected over the years. Make use of the research material that you will find inside the house. You will have to look carefully for it, as objects in this house appear to gain a life of their own. Use my findings to make your own decisions. If you join me on my quest, you may be rewarded with great knowledge, but be warned, you may not like everything that you find.
There are two basic formats for an exorcism. One is used quite frequently where one is actually aware of something within all of us that's not quite right. Church calls that sin, if you like, but it's the same origin. We're talking about the very presence of something which isn't good. Again, if I could just illustrate that, I mean, this is quite a gentle little format, where we would pray over an individual or a group of individuals and say something like, Father of mercy, you led the man born blind to the kingdom of light through the gift of faith in your Son. Free these from false values that surround and blind them. Set them firmly in your truth, children of the light forever. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. That's more or less what I'd call an everyday situation, not that I use that every day. There is a second form, though, which is perhaps much, much more serious, and there we would eventually have to call in the designated man from the diocese who would be appointed by the bishop to actually do an exorcism. Now, I've never actually witnessed one, but I've spoken to an exorcist, and it normally has to be accompanied, in the case of the exorcist, by a lot of prayer and fasting, actually prior to the little ritual. In the actual ritual itself, again, there is prayer. There's usually the laying on of hands to actually expel the presence of evil, devil, demon, whatever we would want to call it. And then very often, nearly always, a sprinkling with holy water. The tie there with the use of holy water is to baptism, when we were actually made children of God. So it would be, if you like, to install the presence of God within that individual and to cast out any possible manifestation of evil. The only other little detail I think that probably needs to be added is that it can be, again I've gleaned this secondhand from the exorcist himself, can be quite a violent thing if the manifestation, the presence of evil is so strong. He said that having done this, which was done in a kind of an old-fashioned vestry with wrought iron windows or what have you round about the actual baptistry, he was actually hurled against the wrought iron. So there was quite a force, if you like, as the devil came out of the individual, and he was quite severely bruised afterwards. So again, it's not something to trip into lightly, and again, it's why somebody has to be designated by the bishop to do that. No. I think if we went to the simple definition of a disembodied presence of somebody who died, we'd actually say a ghost is no more or no less than just simply something which is non-physical, non-material, can't actually touch. Although, again, some people have actually spoken to me of almost like a spine-chilling experience of having felt somebody or something pass by them. The hairs on their arms sort of stand up on end. Somebody actually described it as she felt that somebody had gone physically right through her, and it was just chilling. So I wouldn't say that ghosts are manifestations of evil. If we went one stage, if we took that as the bottom plateau, as it were, went one stage above that, we'd actually talk about poltergeists. A little bit more physical there. There you've got sort of things coming off pictures and things flying around rooms and what have you. But again, the general definition is more of a mischievous spirit and not actually wishing evil to happen to the other individual. And the third, and probably the most extreme case, we'd say, diametrically opposed to ghosts, is where one would need to think about exorcism, a positive manifestation of something which was evil or which wished to cause harm to another individual.
Unless you want your luck to make a turn for the worse, never sit in another person's chair soon after they have left it. Bettiscombe Manor is quiet these days, but it was not always so. The villagers in this lonely nook of the Dorset countryside still recall tales of a terrifying scream that was said to originate from a skull kept in the manor. In 1685, Azariah Pinney, the lord of Bettiscombe Manor, was banished to the West Indies for his allegiance to the Duke of Monmouth. A man of acute business sense, Pinney made good his exile and prospered in the God-forsaken colony, accruing a vast fortune which was turned over to his heirs on his death. 2 generations were to pass before any of Azariah's kin dared set foot on English soil. It was his grandson, John Frederick, who returned to England in 1734 to reclaim the family seat in Dorset, bearing considerable riches and a Negro servant from the Isles. However, shortly after their arrival in the country, Frederick's manservant, Isaac, was stricken with a malady that racked his body for days and only eased when the wretched fellow approached death. It was on his deathbed that old Isaac, who had served the family well, pleaded with his master that he must be taken back to his homeland for burial. If not, a terrible curse would befall the manor and all who lived therein. A phlegmatic man, John Frederick was not given to superstition, and duly ignored his slave's dying wish, discreetly burying his body in the local churchyard. It was then that the howling came. At first, many thought it a prank played by schoolchildren, defying one another to remain in the churchyard after dark. But when one of the youngsters returned home, ashen-faced and shaking with fear after hearing a strange groan emerge from one of the graves, the games stopped and few would enter the graveyard again, and the wailing continued, louder than ever, a wild, keening sound that chilled the soul and which could be heard for miles around. The villagers knew the source of the shrieking, but Frederick would not heed their desperate pleas and refused to disinter the remains of his servant, and so the howling was joined by tremors and thunderclaps that shook the very foundations of Bettiscombe Manor. It seemed as if Isaac's corpse had risen from his defiled grave and was hammering angrily at the doors and shutters of his former household. If Isaac couldn't rest in peace, neither would his master. The din was appalling, but it had its desired effect, almost. Finally, 2 sleepless months after Isaac's burial, John Frederick wearily succumbed to the inevitable and exhumed the body of his servant. In such haste was the deed done that Isaac's rotting head was rudely detached from his body. Yet rather than return Isaac's complete remains to the West Indies, Frederick shipped his body back for burial, but kept the skull as a ghoulish memento of his recent travails. The skull was deposited in the loft, and the lord of Bettiscombe Manor retired for an early night, comforted by the belief that he had done all in his power to appease Isaac's vengeful spirit, and a blissful silence descended upon the village once more. And so it stayed, until John Frederick's own death a decade later. However, the new occupant of the manor, William Thornton, had not been apprised of the skull's presence, and upon seeing its ghastly village, had it thrown into a pond behind the house. He instantly learned the error of his hasty actions, as an ear-splitting scream rent the air and drove him to the sanctuary of his manor. Quick were his neighbours to inform him of the nature of the cry, and the penalty for ignoring old Isaac's wishes. But Thornton was a proud man, and steadfastly rejected any attempts to retrieve the skull and let it defile his house again. No matter how much Isaac's ghost bellowed into the night sky or raged against the manor with his phantom fists, Thornton would not yield. Nor would he accept the accusation, that Isaac's clamorous protestations were responsible for an unaccountable crop failure that year, or for the mysterious death of livestock in the region. It was to prove a fatal stand. On a bitterly cold January morning, the lord of Bettiscombe Manor was found in a state of collapse by the edge of the pond, dressed only in a sodden nightshirt. Driven mad with fatigue, his spirit had finally broken, and he had stayed up the long night, raking the pond for the accursed skull, to no avail. He spent the rest of his short, tormented life on a sickbed in the wing furthest from the pond, but he could not shut out the damnable screeching. Within a year of taking possession of Bettiscombe Manor, William Thornton, a man of rugged health and fierce temperament, was dead, having faded to a shambling shadow of his former self. After his funeral, held many miles from Isaac's former resting place, a handful of villagers recovered the screaming skull from the pond, stole into Bettiscombe Manor under cover of dark, and restored the dread relic to the loft, and there it languished, content and quiet, for well over 100 years, as each of the manor's subsequent proprietors wisely paid greater heed to the legend of the screaming skull than their ill-fated predecessors. Most would never visit the loft, lest they encounter Isaac's spectre in a less charitable mood. But when Bettiscombe Manor passed into the hands of Charles Pomeroy in the early part of this century, events took a bizarre turn. The new owner, a modern gentleman of liberal disposition, promptly removed the skull, now encrusted in dust and a curiously sticky residue, had it polished, and reinstated the grisly heirloom to a more prominent position in the household. It was a well-meaning gesture and an effort on Pomeroy's part to return some measure of dignity to the memory of a former resident of the manor. He could not have imagined what followed. On the eve of the Great War, a torrent of blood issued from the cracks in Isaac's newly veneered skull, staining the mantelpiece on which it stood, and the blood would not cease. So shocked were visitors to the manor that Pomeroy was forced to return the weeping artifact to the loft. There it remained, reportedly oozing blood, when the outbreak of war was imminent. Peace now reigns at Bettiscombe Manor, but should anyone ever be tempted to remove the skull from its adopted home, old Isaac's spirit will scream the place down.
It was on a Sunday morning, very warm, very hot, about 11 o'clock in the morning, and the group of people I was with went off for a walk, and I decided that I was going to play the trumpet. I was outside, I think I was playing Summertime or something like that, and quite suddenly I was terrified. I mean, I really was absolutely petrified. I was cold, I had shivers down my back, and I was so scared I ran into the house. And I didn't know why I was scared, I just was. What I realised was, when I stopped playing, there was no sound at all, nothing. No birds, no pigeons, the trees weren't moving, none of the trees. Now in a forest, the chance of trees not being moved by wind is almost nil, but nothing was moving, there was no sound at all. That night, I was in bed, I don't know what time it was, maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it was quite late. And I woke up, and again I was absolutely terrified, and I couldn't breathe this time. I mean, I really couldn't breathe. I was, and that was it. But there was definitely something was getting at me that day. The two incidents just couldn't, especially the still trees. I mean, that's the thing. Still trees and no birds singing in a forest.
But it was, well, well, if that wasn't being haunted, I don't know what was. You know, I mean, it's really quite a serious thing, which I'll never forget.
Local vet Keith Michael has assured us that the cat will make a full recovery. And finally, tonight's special report investigates a real-life haunting. The residents of this 300-year-old house, set deep in the countryside of West Yorkshire, England, have been experiencing strange phenomena. An apparition of a woman, known as the Nanny, has been seen in various locations around the house, invariably carrying washing in her arms. Local historian Norman Reed told our reporter that local records show that a wet nurse lived here in the 18th century. Witness Mavis Hartley is convinced that the apparition she has seen is the spirit of this woman. We have arranged for Ruth Breary, a woman with psychic abilities, to visit the house to give her opinion of the ghostly events. She has not spoken to the residents before and has been told nothing of the events. Ruth's visit to the house proved largely uneventful until she entered the small bedroom on the first floor. She made the following statement to our reporter after the event. As soon as I stepped into the bedroom, I felt a wave of oppressive cold come from the eaves and near the fireplace. I knew that this was a place where the spirit had slept. I didn't need to see her to know she was there. You've been watching Viewpoint. I'm Rhea Searcher. Good night.
Look closely at the cinders within the hearth. If you find any that are shaped like a coffin, there may be a death in the family. Look
Lots of things have frightened me, but not ghostly things. In the course of investigating supposedly haunted places, I've been down in cellars with no lights on and no torch, just hoping something will come out of the slimy walls. I've slept in several bedrooms where I've been told no one slept there for 20 years, and I sort of go to bed and go to sleep, wishing something spooky would come along. As a child, I can certainly remember seeing apparitional type things and being frightened. But nowadays, if I see something like that, I think, oh, there comes an apparition. I think it's my own mind, so it's not remotely frightening. I'm quite happy to go to bed at night, see all kinds of things being created by my mind, and they don't spook me. So the answer is no, but of course it might happen. I might get a terrible shock and one day go to a haunted place and see that ghost that I so far don't believe in.
The case at the empty haunted church, where the team and I went to look because we'd been told by various students and people that they'd seen figures moving in the gloom there. This particular church I didn't know existed, but when we went there, figures did move in the gloom. There were tombstones which had been disturbed. This strange mist filtered into the church. The atmosphere was intensely oppressive. That was probably the most frightening case that we actually went to.
There was one case, I think, that was interesting from the point of view that my fellow investigator and myself were somewhat scared. You get blasé about this, but we were in a house, an old house up in the Fens, north of Cambridge, and in a room that nobody would sleep in or live in, because they said funny things happened to them, and they were using it to store furniture. And when they put electricity in the house, they put everything else but in that one room, and we're in there. And sitting there, and we got all the other helpers, actual members of the University Society downstairs, doing a Ouija board, not to communicate, but to get everybody round so that we could control them. And suddenly there's bumps and thumps coming. We locked the door from that direction across the bare boards. And I'm saying to Alan, this is my friend, Alan, cut it out. He's saying, just cut it out yourself. I said, well, it's not me. And bang, 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 we got two torches. And we're showing, I mean, we've known each other for years. I knew he wasn't doing it, he knew it, but it got quite scary because it's a thump, 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 you see. And the last thump was on a brass bedstead over my head. And I thought, wow, I don't like this. And Alan said the same, more or less the same thing. That people were making a noise downstairs, and we used that as an excuse to go down and tell them to keep quiet. We got to the door, and we forgot that we had put strings across there in case somebody was going to take us for a ride. And we went through there and collided with that, came back, and as we came back, we heard a noise, and we swung our torches round and we saw a chair going across the room and land bang on the wall. That was a bit scary.
When she was about 13, she came down to breakfast one morning and said that she had seen a Roman in a toga in her bedroom. And I thought, oh yes, that sounds a bit far-fetched, a teenage fantasy. But Debbie, later on that day, went out in the garden and was playing and came in with a small coin in her hand, which turned out to be a Roman coin with the head of Septimus Severus on it. So I was quite excited by this because it was quite unusual. And so soon after seeing this Roman in her room, about 3 months later, she had the same experience and saw the same gentleman in her bedroom, and she found the second coin on the site, and soon afterwards she saw him again and found the third coin on the site. Now all the coins had the same head, the head of Septimus Severus on them. Once was unusual, twice was coincidence, 3 times was a bit more than coincidence. And although I've never experienced or seen Septimus Severus there at all, we do have funny things happen in the house, like the curtains have been taken down, all sorts of odd things of that nature. And I believe that Debbie saw him because she happens to be susceptible to these things.
As I looked up, on the top right-hand side window there was what I thought was a face, you know, somebody looking out, and those rooms aren't actually used anymore because, you know, they're rotten, completely rotten. It looked like a child. It looked like just a little boy. It was so quick. It was just as, it was like a blink. It was just like I just don't know. It just looked like a little boy. I mean, other things do happen here. It's the room upstairs. It contains all the cleaning things that we have in the shop, which is the overstock. Normally, things are sort of ruxed about, thrown on the floor. Like we have big 1 kilogram tubs of Swarthega. We had 5 of those broken in different places on the floor upstairs. That was overnight and everything's locked up, obviously, when we go to work, so nobody could have possibly gone in there. Like last year, I was getting some garden furniture and there was somebody walking about upstairs and I needed some help. And I called out and there was nobody there, and it sort of stopped. And when I went back out there, there was somebody pacing about upstairs again. So I ran upstairs and there was nobody there. There's nobody in the room.
If you want some advice to get ahead, there's more to the laboratory than meets the eye. If you cross the North Downs in the county of Surrey, just east of Guildford, you will come to the tiny hamlet of Shear. Continue south for another mile, and you will enter Hurt Wood, an ancient and lush forest on the edge of the Downs. Beneath its heavy canopy of oak and ash, deep in its wooded folds, a clear and tranquil pool will present itself, its banks lined with willow, its rim turning to moss. This is the silent pool of legend, whose lower depths hold a violent and brooding secret. In Saxon times, the silent pool was a godsend for weary travellers who chanced upon it when losing their way in the forest. For Emma and Philip, who lived and worked in the woods, it was far more. It was their secret place, where they could forget the long labours of the day and bathe in the pool's placid waters. The daughter and son of Benjamin, the local woodsman, the pair were inseparable, and they had taken over many of the daily chores after the recent death of their mother. Emma, the eldest, was a striking beauty, who reminded Benjamin so much of his dear wife. Now approaching womanhood, she would soon marry and raise a family of her own. Philip was a lad of strong heart and limb and devoted to his sister. The household was beginning to recover from the grief that had stricken it earlier that year, when the appearance of a dark stranger changed their lives forever. On an uncommonly hot day in autumn, a finely attired nobleman, hopelessly lost and in need of a drink to slake his powerful thirst, stumbled upon the woodcutter's hut. Unprepared for such a visitor, but knowing the dangerous caprice of such men, Benjamin reluctantly entertained him, sharing what little refreshment he had with his taciturn guest. While Philip attended the patrician's steed, Emma served their uninvited caller the last of their water, and then eagerly took her leave to fetch more from her secret refuge. On arriving at the pool, flushed and breathless, Emma felt no compunction to hurry back, but instead disrobed and entered the water's cool, inviting embrace. So enchanted was she by the serene beauty of her surrounds that she failed to hear a horse approach until it was too late. The rider burst from the woods and reined in his steed at the water's edge, near Emma's discarded clothes, uttering not a word. It was her father's mysterious guest, and now she turned abruptly from him, clasping her hands around her naked frame. She pleaded with him for her garments, but the man made no move or sound, merely staring at her with an intensity that terrified Emma. And then, without warning, he spurred his mount into the pool towards her. Emma's pulse quickened, and she struggled further into the silent waters, though she could not swim. The stranger ignored her entreaties and drove his horse forward. Emma now feared for her life as much as her virtue, and so she waded even further into the pool, the waters growing darker and colder with every step, until her toes could no longer feel the bottom, and still the horseman advanced. Sobbing convulsively and now feeling a numbness creep up her flailing legs, Emma screamed as loud as her tightening lungs would allow, instinctively reaching out to the mysterious intruder. The rider merely removed a glove and flung it with casual disdain in the direction of the drowning girl's outstretched hands. Emma let out one more frantic yell before her mouth filled with water. Deep in the woods, Philip heard his sister's scream and rushed as fast as his limbs could carry him in the direction of the cry. When he reached the pool, Philip could at first see only the stranger on his steed a short way out from the bank. But then he caught sight of Emma thrashing wildly in the deepest part of the pool. Wading in without a second thought, Philip reached his sister, whose energy had been all but sapped by the icy waters which now enveloped them both. Yet he could not keep her head above water, and his own strength began to fail him. In one last desperate lunge he tried to push his sister towards the bank, but he fell back under the effort, and the pool's inky depths dragged them down slowly and inexorably. They never surfaced again. The stranger scratched his beard idly, turned his horse, and rode off into the forest. Behind him, The waters of the pool stilled over like a glassy sheet, leaving no trace of the tragedy that took place barely moments ago. When his children did not return home that evening, Benjamin desperately searched for them in all the places he knew they liked to dally, and in time came upon the silent pool, but he could see nothing there, and returned home distraught and tired. He would redouble his efforts tomorrow. And so the woodsman continued his search, time and again returning to the pool, until, on one occasion, something caused him to linger by the bank. The noonday sun was just clearing the tops of the trees overhead, its rays playing across the becalmed surface of the pool, when Benjamin was momentarily blinded by the glint of something bright on the far bank. He hurried around to the other side, but when he got there, what he saw broke his heart, and he wept like a child. There before him, bobbing near the water's edge, were the pale, bloated bodies of his children, still bonded together after death. He waded in and began to pull them back out when he noticed, locked in Emma's frozen grip, a silver gauntlet, which had to be prized from her fingers for him to look at it more closely. Standing waist-deep in the accursed pool with the bodies of his dead children floating beside him, Benjamin examined the crest on the glove, and his body shook with helpless rage. For the owner of the glove was not only the self-same lord to whom he gave succour some days before, but also none other than Prince John, Regent of England. His evil was beyond punishment by any other than God, the same God who had now taken his whole family from him. Do not tarry long at the edge of the silent pool, for you might witness the spirit of the drowning maiden rising from her watery grave, a chilling scream on her lips. There she will stare you dead in the eye, and in a heartbeat rush towards you across the pool's shimmering, hushed surface. The answer lies in Easter.
I was a very sceptical young man at school here in Cambridge. I thought I knew all the answers. Science would explain everything, you know. And why did people believe in ghosts? Absolute rubbish. I mean, scientific age. But I got a mother at home who was a very sensible little woman, and she seemed to be able to forecast what was going to happen. It was a contradiction, you see. I knew my mother was sensible, she wasn't nuts, and yet somehow or other science seemed to explain everything. So I thought, well, I don't know, this is odd. And I went out to India, and I was in the Navy, and I saw some very peculiar things out there. The most peculiar thing, I was told that we were all on leave up in the Nilgiri Hills, which is South India, 6,000 feet up. And I was told that there was a fakir, a holy man, up in the mountains. Anyway, cut a long story short, I went up to see him. It was a long climb up this hill, and there he was on a flat piece of ground with a sheer drop on the other side. And I had to go through a gully, and he knew I was there. And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I hear you can do miracles." And he said, "All right, okay, but you're far too materialistic. But anyway, I'll give you what you want. Look over the hills, my son." Said, about 70. Look over the hills. And I thought, well, I'd better pacify this silly old twit. I'm looking over the hills. He's standing here. And I think, that's funny. And I turn, and he's not there. He's the other side of a stream rushing down. Now, I was a boxer in those days and very fit, and I couldn't have done it. And I thought, how'd you get there? Cunning old devil, ropes, hell, couldn't do it, I can't do it. And he's saying, look over the hills, and I'm looking, look over the hills, and I thought, I'd better look over the hills, what? And then the voice says, well, my son, did that entertain you? And he's back to me. It shook me rigid. I was very arrogant to start with. When I went down that hill from that little episode, I wasn't half as cocky as when I went up.
My views about ghosts and hauntings, and indeed about many other psychic phenomena, have changed dramatically since I first got interested more than 20 years ago. When I first came to know about these things, and I read books about ghosts and I heard all these stories about them, it seemed to me obvious to believe them, and I did believe them. And I started to theorize about, where could ghosts be coming from? Could they be, somehow imbibed in the walls and giving out vibrations? And I made up lots of theories of my own, and because I believed all the stories. After a few years of doing research in parapsychology and doing my own experiments and so on, I began to become far more skeptical, simply because I didn't find psychic phenomena in the lab. But I still thought, well, out there are ghosts and so on. And then I began investigating, going to haunted houses, being called on when people had poltergeists and so on. And gradually the same thing happened there. The more I began to learn about them, the more I saw things at first hand, the more I really questioned people carefully, the more it seemed to me that psychological phenomena and not psychic or paranormal phenomena lay behind the ghosts.